9:47 a.m. on August 18, 2025, Sharon Osbourne did something she hadn't done in 43 years of marriage, 25 years of television, and countless crisis interviews. She stopped talking, not the dramatic pause of a seasoned performer, not the calculated silence of a master manipulator. This was complete, devastating breakdown in real time, and it lasted exactly 47 seconds that felt like an eternity to everyone watching. But here's what those 8 million viewers didn't see. What happened in the green room just 12 minutes before Sharon walked onto that set reveals everything about why Britain's toughest woman finally shattered on national television. The producers had been walking on eggshells for days. This was supposed to be a celebration interview, a tribute to Ozzy's incredible Birmingham performance, maybe some light questions about his retirement plans. Nobody expected Sharon Osbourne, the woman who'd handled everything from drug overdoses to family scandals with military precision, to arrive looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Rebecca Martinez, the show's senior producer, noticed it first. Sharon's ritual was always the same. Arrive exactly 15 minutes early, demand the green room temperature be set to 68 degrees, review her talking points while applying lipstick that never needed touching up, and walk onto set like she owned the building. For 2 decades, this routine had been clockwork. August 18th was different. Sharon arrived 17 minutes early, which might seem insignificant to anyone else, but to the crew who'd worked with her for years, it was like seeing Superman stumble. She sat in that green room chair, staring at her phone, but her thumb wasn't moving. She wasn't scrolling, wasn't texting, wasn't doing anything. Just staring at a black screen like it held answers to questions she couldn't bring herself to ask. The makeup artist, Jenny, had worked with Sharon dozens of times. She knew exactly how Sharon liked her foundation, which shade of lipstick complemented the studio lighting, how to contour her cheekbones for the cameras. But that morning, Jenny watched Sharon's hands shake so violently she couldn't apply her own mascara. For a woman who'd been putting on makeup since she was 12, who could do it in moving cars and emergency situations, this was unthinkable. "Mrs. Osbourne, would you like me to help with that?" Jenny asked gently, watching Sharon attempt the same mascara stroke for the 4th time. Sharon's response stopped everyone in the room cold. "I don't know why I'm bothering, he's not going to see it anyway." That's when Rebecca realized this wasn't going to be the interview they'd planned. This was a woman in free fall, and they were about to put her on live television in front of 8 million people who expected the Sharon Osbourne they knew, the one who could handle anything. But the real crisis started when Sharon's phone rang at 9:35 a.m., 12 minutes before airtime. The ringtone was Crazy Train, Ozzy's signature song, which she'd programmed specifically for his calls years ago because it always made her smile. Hearing it that morning, for the first time since he died, nearly sent her to the floor. The phone rang 4 times. Sharon stared at it, her face cycling through confusion, hope, and then crushing reality. Because for just those few seconds, her brain had forgotten. Grief does that sometimes. It creates these moments where reality resets to what it used to be, where your husband is still alive and still calling you 3 times a day just to hear your voice. When the ringtone finally stopped, Sharon looked around that green room like she was seeing it for the first time. Like she'd just woken up from a dream and couldn't figure out where she was or why she was there. And that's when Jenny, Rebecca, and the 2 production assistants realized they were watching someone's entire world collapse in real time. "I can't do this," Sharon whispered, so quietly that Jenny had to lean closer to hear her. "I've been pretending I can handle this, but I can't. I don't know how to talk about him like he's gone because he doesn't feel gone. He feels like he's just in the other room, and if I talk loud enough, he'll hear me and come back." Rebecca faced an impossible choice: cancel the interview and disappoint 8 million viewers, or put a grieving widow on live television and hope for the best. But Sharon made the decision for her. "No, I'm going to do it. I have to do it. He'd want me to do it. But I need you all to understand something. I'm not okay. I haven't been okay since he died, and I'm not going to magically become okay in the next 10 minutes. So whatever happens out there happens." Walking from that green room to the studio set took 37 steps. Rebecca counted them because she was timing everything trying to calculate how much could go wrong in the space between grief and live television. But watching Sharon walk those 37 steps was like watching someone march to their own execution. The armor was gone. The legendary Sharon Osbourne swagger that had intimidated record executives and made her famous was nowhere to be found. In its place was a 73-year-old woman who just lost the love of her life and had no idea how to exist without him. When the cameras started rolling, Sharon tried to summon that familiar strength. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, prepared to deliver the performance that millions of people expected. But then the interviewer asked the simplest, most innocent question imaginable. "Sharon, how are you holding up?" 4 words that should have triggered Sharon's autopilot response. She'd answered that question 1,000 times in 1,000 different crisis situations, usually with something sharp and dismissive, something that made it clear she wasn't someone you worried about. Instead, she opened her mouth and nothing came out. Literally nothing. For 47 seconds that felt like 47 years, Sharon Osbourne sat in that interview chair and couldn't speak, couldn't pretend, couldn't perform, couldn't be anyone other than a woman whose heart had been torn out of her chest 2 weeks earlier. The control room went into panic mode. Technical directors checking for audio problems, producers debating whether to cut to commercial, everyone trying to figure out how to handle something they'd never seen before. Sharon Osbourne, speechless. But here's what made those 47 seconds so devastating to watch. Sharon wasn't crying yet. She wasn't dramatically breaking down or making a scene. She was just empty, like someone had reached inside her and removed everything that made her Sharon Osbourne, leaving behind only the shell of a person who used to be capable of anything. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and it carried the weight of every single day she'd spent loving a man who was never supposed to survive this long. "I don't know how I'm holding up. I don't know how to hold up. I don't know how to do any of this without him." And that's when 8 million people realized they weren't watching an interview anymore. They were watching someone's soul break in real time. The woman who'd spent 40 years protecting everyone else from seeing her vulnerable was finally, completely, utterly defenseless. The producers in that control room, the crew on that set, the millions of people watching at home, everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't celebrity grief performed for cameras. This was raw, unfiltered human devastation, and it was happening to someone they'd believed was unbreakable. Britain didn't just stop breathing during those 47 seconds. Britain realized that even the strongest people have limits. Even warriors eventually face battles they can't win. Even Sharon Osbourne, the woman who'd survived everything, couldn't survive losing the one person who'd made survival worthwhile. To understand why those white roses meant everything to Elvis, you have to go back to October 9, 1973, the day Priscilla Presley made the hardest decision of her life, and the world got it completely wrong. The headlines screamed about other women, about Elvis's affairs, about irreconcilable differences. The tabloids painted Priscilla as the scorned wife who couldn't handle her husband's wandering eye. They made Elvis look like the typical rock star who'd thrown away his family for fame and cheap thrills. Every single word of it was a lie. The truth happened in their bedroom at Graceland on a Tuesday morning when Elvis thought Priscilla was still asleep. She'd been lying there for 20 minutes, listening to him pace the floor like a caged animal, muttering to himself the way he did when the demons in his head got too loud to ignore. "I'm killing her," he whispered, probably thinking she couldn't hear. "I'm killing everyone I love." Priscilla had been watching Elvis destroy himself for months. The pills that were supposed to help him sleep but kept him wired for days. The eating binges followed by weeks where he'd barely touch food. The wild mood swings that left everyone around him walking on eggshells, never knowing if they'd get the Elvis who lit up every room he entered or the Elvis who raged at shadows only he could see. But it wasn't his self-destruction that broke her heart. It was watching him carry the weight of everyone else's happiness on shoulders that were already buckling under pressure he'd never learned how to handle. She got out of bed that morning and found him in the bathroom, staring at himself in the mirror with an expression she'd never seen before. Pure self-hatred. "Elvis, what's wrong?" He turned to look at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. Not the tears of a man feeling sorry for himself, but the tears of someone who'd finally seen the truth and couldn't bear it. "I did this to you," he said. "Look at what I've done to you." Priscilla looked at herself in that mirror and saw what he was seeing. The woman who used to laugh so easily she could barely catch her breath. The girl who'd once danced around Graceland like it was her own personal fairy tale. That person was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at loud noises, who flinched when people moved too quickly, who'd learned to read Elvis's moods like a survival skill. "You didn't do anything to me, Elvis. We're just going through a rough patch." But Elvis shook his head, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "I'm sick. Something's wrong with me and it's getting worse. I can feel it eating me alive from the inside, and everyone who loves me gets caught in the fire. My mama died worrying about me. My daddy's agging 10 years for every one of mine. And you," he reached out like he wanted to touch her face but stopped himself. "You used to shine, baby. You used to light up every room, and now you look like you're afraid of your own shadow. Because of me, because of what loving me costs." This was the conversation Priscilla never told anyone about. Not her family, not her closest friends, not the lawyers during the divorce proceedings. Because how do you explain that your husband didn't leave you for another woman? He pushed you away because he loved you too much to watch himself destroy you. "That's not true," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew he was right. She had changed. The spontaneous girl who'd fallen in love with Elvis's laugh and his vulnerability had become someone who calculated every word, every reaction, every breath to avoid triggering one of his episodes. "It is true, and you know it," Elvis said. "I see how you look at me sometimes, like you're waiting for me to explode. I see how you've stopped talking about your dreams because you're too busy managing mine. I see how you've made yourself smaller and smaller trying to fit into the space my problems leave for you." The worst part was that he wasn't wrong. Priscilla had given up pieces of herself so gradually she hadn't even noticed until they were gone. Her art, her friends outside of Elvis's world, her own opinions about things that mattered. She'd become an expert at being whatever Elvis needed her to be, and somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten who she was when she wasn't being that. "But I love you," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "I know you do, and that's exactly the problem." Elvis sat down on the edge of their bathtub and put his head in his hands. "Your love is the only thing keeping me alive, Scylla. It's also the thing that's killing you." This was the moment that changed everything. Not another woman, not career pressures, not the tabloid stories everyone would blame later. This was Elvis Presley having the most selfless moment of his life, seeing clearly for maybe the first time how his pain was poisoning the person he loved most. "What are you saying?" But Priscilla already knew. She could hear it in his voice, see it in the way he couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm saying maybe you should go. Maybe you should take Lisa Marie and go somewhere I can't hurt you anymore." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Priscilla had ever heard. It stretched between them like a chasm, filled with everything they weren't saying, that they both knew he was right, that staying meant watching him die slowly and taking her down with him, that leaving meant abandoning him when he needed her most. "You want me to leave?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I want you to live." Elvis finally looked up at her, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. "I want you to remember what it feels like to laugh without checking to see if it's too loud. I want you to make decisions based on what you want instead of what might keep me stable. I want you to love someone who makes you bigger instead of smaller." "There is no one else, Elvis. There never could be." "Maybe not right now, but someday, if you let yourself heal from what loving me has cost you, maybe there could be." They sat in that bathroom for 3 hours, talking about things they never had the courage to say out loud. About how Elvis's success had become a prison for both of them. About how the pressures of his career had turned their love into a performance for everyone else's benefit. About how they'd both lost themselves trying to live up to the fairy tale everyone expected them to be. But mostly, they talked about Lisa Marie. about how she deserved a mother who wasn't constantly walking on eggshells and a father who didn't scare her with his unpredictability, about how children learn what love looks like from watching their parents and what were they teaching her. "If I leave," Priscilla said finally, "it has to look like it's my choice. I won't have the world thinking you abandoned us." Elvis nodded. "The lawyers can make up whatever story they need to. Let them blame me for everything. I can handle that." But here's what destroyed them both. They made this decision out of love, pure, sacrificial love that put the other person's well-being above their own happiness. Elvis was willing to be painted as the villain if it meant Priscilla could start over. Priscilla was willing to leave the love of her life if it meant he might find peace. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, and the media ran with stories about Elvis's affairs and Priscilla's independence. None of it was true. The truth was much simpler and much more heartbreaking. Sometimes love means walking away. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's self-destruction, even when that someone is your whole world. Priscilla left Graceland in January of 1973, but she never stopped loving Elvis. She just loved him enough to save herself, hoping that maybe, someday, there would be enough left of both of them to try again. She never told anyone that Elvis called her every single night for the first 6 months after she left, not to beg her to come back, but to make sure she was okay, to make sure she was remembering how to be herself again. Those white roses in August of 1977, they were her way of telling him the truth he'd been too broken to hear when she left. Leaving him hadn't changed how much she loved him. It had just changed how much she was willing to sacrifice for that love. And maybe, just maybe, it was her way of saying that 4 years later, she'd finally figured out how to love him without losing herself. But by then, it was almost too late. Here's what nobody understood about Sharon Osbourne's breakdown on that breakfast show. The woman crying on television wasn't just grieving a husband. She was mourning the death of her entire identity. Because for 43 years, Sharon Osbourne had been two completely different people, and only one of them was allowed to exist in public. The world knew the warrior, the woman who could destroy careers with a single phone call, the manager who made grown record executives cry and sent flowers to their funerals afterward, the television personality who turned dysfunction into entertainment and made it look effortless. That Sharon was legendary, untouchable, and completely artificial. The real Sharon Osbourne died a little bit every day for 4 decades, sacrificing pieces of herself to build an armor strong enough to protect the man she loved from an industry designed to consume him. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It started in 1979 when 27-year-old Sharon Osbourne took over managing a self-destructive alcoholic who'd just been kicked out of Black Sabbath for being too unpredictable even for them. She wasn't trying to become anyone's savior. She was a young woman trying to make it in a business that ate people alive, especially women who dared to think they belonged there. What she got instead was Ozzy Osbourne, not the legend, not the icon, but a broken man-child who was drinking himself to death and taking everyone around him down with him. The first time Sharon had to physically drag him out of a bar to prevent him from starting a fight that would have ended his career, she realized something that terrified her. If she wanted to love this man, she was going to have to become someone strong enough to save him from himself. But the moment that changed everything, the specific incident that forced Sharon to weaponize her own reputation, happened in 1982, 3 years into managing Ozzy's solo career. They were negotiating a record deal that could make or break his future, and the executive across the table looked directly at Sharon and said, "Sweetheart, why don't you get us some coffee while the men handle the business?" Sharon had 2 choices. She could smile, get the coffee, and watch Ozzy get destroyed by a contract that would have stolen everything he'd worked for. Or she could show this executive exactly what happened when you underestimated Sharon Osbourne. She chose option 3. Sharon stood up, walked around that conference table, and leaned down until she was inches from the executive's face. In a voice so cold it could have frozen hell, she said, "Let me explain something to you. I am not your sweetheart. I am not your secretary. I am the only thing standing between you and the most profitable artist you'll ever have the chance to work with. And if you ever speak to me like that again, I will make sure your name becomes synonymous with the stupidest mistake in music industry history." The room went silent, not just quiet, but that kind of complete silence that happens when everyone realizes the power dynamic just shifted permanently. When Sharon sat back down, she wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that room. She was someone harder, sharper, more dangerous. And it worked. The executive apologized, the deal got negotiated fairly, and Ozzy's solo career was born. But Sharon paid a price for that victory that she's still paying today. She discovered that being feared was more effective than being respected, that reputation could be weaponized, that becoming someone people were afraid to cross was the most efficient way to protect the person she loved. Over the next 40 years, Sharon perfected this persona until it became indistinguishable from who she really was. Every harsh negotiation, every public confrontation, every moment where she seemed ruthless and unforgiving, it was all in service of keeping Ozzy safe in an industry designed to exploit artists like him. The cruel irony is that Sharon became famous for being tough, but she never wanted to be tough. She wanted to be soft and vulnerable, and all the things that would have gotten Ozzy destroyed within 6 months. So she made herself into his shield, and shields don't get to have feelings. The reality TV show in the early 2000s should have been Sharon's chance to show the world who she really was beneath all that armor. Instead, it became another performance. The Sharon on The Osbournes was still a character, still a version of herself designed to protect her family from judgment while making their dysfunction palatable for mass consumption. People saw the Sharon who could laugh off chaos and make family dysfunction look charming. What they didn't see was the Sharon who lay awake every night listening to Ozzy breathe, terrified that each breath might be his last. The Sharon who counted his pills every morning and learned to recognize the subtle signs that meant another crisis was coming. The Sharon who trained herself to sleep light because someone might need saving at 3 in the morning. "I've spent so much of my life being rude to people in business," Sharon admitted years later. "Standing up for myself and for him, you get a reputation for being something you're really not. You're actually somebody quite different." That somebody different was a woman who cried every time she had to fire someone, even when they deserved it. A woman who sent anonymous gifts to people she'd had to be harsh with professionally. A woman who wrote apology letters she never sent because maintaining her reputation was more important than clearing her conscience. The weight of carrying that dual identity for 4 decades would have crushed most people. But Sharon had something most people don't have. She had a reason that made all the sacrifice worthwhile. Every time she had to be cruel to protect Ozzy, every time she had to choose reputation over humanity, every time she had to be someone she didn't want to be, she could go home to the one person who knew exactly who she really was. Ozzy never saw the warrior. When Sharon walked through their front door, the armor came off. She could be vulnerable, scared, uncertain, all the things she couldn't afford to be anywhere else. He was the only person on earth who got to see Sharon Arden instead of Sharon Osbourne, and that made every sacrifice worth it. But here's what Sharon realized sitting in that breakfast television chair, crying in front of 8 million people. The armor hadn't just protected Ozzy from the world. It had protected Sharon from processing her own trauma. For 40 years, she'd been so busy being strong for everyone else that she'd never allowed herself to feel weak. Every overdose she'd managed, every crisis she'd solved, every battle she'd fought on Ozzy's behalf, she'd pushed those experiences down and moved on to the next emergency. There was never time to process the fear, the exhaustion, the crushing weight of being responsible for someone else's survival. Now, with Ozzy gone, Sharon was faced with an impossible question. Who was she when she wasn't protecting him? What was left of Sharon Osbourne when there was no longer an Ozzy to manage, defend, and save? The breakdown wasn't just about grief. It was about identity collapse. The woman the world knew as Sharon Osbourne had been a job, not a person. A role she'd played so convincingly that she'd forgotten where the performance ended and the real woman began. "I don't know how to be just Sharon," she told her therapist weeks after the funeral. "I've been Sharon and Ozzy for so long that I don't remember what I was like before him. I don't know what I want, what I like, what makes me happy when it's not connected to making him happy." The most heartbreaking part of Sharon's story isn't losing Ozzy. It's realizing that in saving him, she'd lost herself. The woman who'd fought harder than anyone for the man she loved had never learned how to fight for her own identity, her own needs, her own right to exist as something other than someone else's protector. That breakfast television interview, those 47 seconds of silence, that complete emotional breakdown, it wasn't weakness. It was the sound of armor finally cracking after 4 decades of protecting everyone except the woman wearing it. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward Sharon Osbourne finding her way back to the surface after 40 years of drowning in Sharon Osbourne's reputation. 3 weeks after that devastating breakfast television interview, Sharon Osbourne sat in her empty house and realized something that changed everything about how she understood loss, legacy, and what it really means to love someone who becomes immortal. The revelation came at 2:17 in the morning, the exact time Ozzy used to wake up and shuffle to the kitchen for water. Sharon had been lying awake, listening for footsteps that would never come, when her phone started buzzing with notifications, hundreds of them, then thousands. A 15-year-old kid in Manchester had posted a video of himself playing Paranoid on guitar in his bedroom. Nothing special about the video itself, just a teenager with questionable technique working through the song that launched a revolution. But within 6 hours, it had been shared 3 million times. The comments section was full of stories. Stories from people whose lives had been changed by that song, by Ozzy's voice, by the permission his music had given them to exist exactly as they were. That's when Sharon understood something that grief had been hiding from her. Ozzy wasn't gone. He'd evolved into something bigger than any one person could ever be. He'd become an idea, and ideas don't die, they multiply. The weight of this realization was overwhelming. Sharon had spent 4 decades protecting Ozzy Osbourne the man. Now she was responsible for protecting Ozzy Osbourne, the immortal concept, and that was a completely different kind of battle. "People keep asking me how I'm going to preserve Ozzy's legacy," Sharon said during her first interview after the breakdown, her voice steadier, but carrying a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. "But his legacy doesn't need preserving. It's alive in every kid who picks up a guitar because they heard Iron Man. It's alive in every parent who realizes that loving your children doesn't mean they have to be perfect. It's alive in every person who's ever felt like they didn't belong and found their tribe through music." But understanding this intellectually and living with it emotionally were 2 completely different things. Sharon found herself drowning in letters, emails, social media messages from people around the world sharing their Ozzy stories. A mother in Japan whose autistic son spoke his first words while listening to Crazy Train. A veteran in Texas who credited War Pigs with helping him process trauma that therapy couldn't touch. A teenage girl in Sweden who said Ozzy's openness about mental health struggles had literally saved her life. Each story was beautiful, each story was meaningful, and each story was another weight added to Sharon's already crushing sense of responsibility. "I used to think immortality meant never dying," Sharon reflected months later. "But immortality isn't about the person who achieves it, it's about everyone who comes after." Ozzy didn't become immortal when he died. He became immortal the first time someone heard his music and realized they weren't alone in the world. This understanding forced Sharon to confront an impossible question. How do you carry forward something that belongs to millions of people? How do you make decisions about a legacy that's bigger than any individual, even the person who created it? The answer came from the most unlikely source. A conversation she'd had with Ozzy years earlier, something she'd forgotten until grief stripped away everything except the most essential memories. They'd been discussing his autobiography, arguing about which stories to include and which ones were too personal to share. Ozzy had looked at her with that mixture of wisdom and mischief that defined him and said, "Sharon, love, the stories don't belong to us anymore. They belong to everyone who needs them. My job was never to be perfect. It was to be honest enough that other people could be honest too. That conversation, forgotten for years, became Sharon's roadmap for managing immortality. Her job wasn't to sanitize Ozzy's image or turn him into some sanitized version of rock sainthood. Her job was to make sure his truth stayed intact, messy and complicated, and real enough to keep helping people long after he was gone. But the most profound shift in Sharon's understanding came when she realized that Ozzy's immortality had transformed her own identity in ways she never expected. For 40 years, she'd been Sharon and Ozzy. Now she was Sharon carrying Ozzy, and that was somehow both heavier and more liberating than anything she'd experienced before. "He's not gone," Sharon finally said during a rare moment of absolute clarity. "He's everywhere. He's in every conversation about mental health that helps someone seek treatment. He's in every parent who learns to love their difficult child unconditionally. He's in every person who realizes that being different isn't a weakness, it's a superpower." The responsibility of carrying this forward wasn't crushing anymore. It was purposeful. Sharon began to understand that her grief could be transformed into mission, that her love for Ozzy could become love for everyone his life and music had touched. She started the Ozzy Osbourne Foundation not as a monument to her dead husband, but as a living extension of what he'd always been. A place for misfits, outcasts, and anyone who needed proof that transformation was possible, that redemption was real, that sometimes the people society writes off become the ones who change everything. The working-class kid from Aston didn't just become famous, Sharon realized. He became proof that anyone can become more than what the world expects of them. That's not a legacy you preserve, that's a legacy you live. Sharon Osbourne's journey from devastating breakdown to carrying forward immortal purpose proves that some love stories don't end with death. They evolve into something bigger than either person could have imagined. Ozzy became immortal not because he never died, but because he gave millions of people permission to live. And Sharon finally discovered who she was when she wasn't protecting someone else. She was the guardian of hope itself, the keeper of a story that proved ordinary people could become extraordinary, the living embodiment of a love that had grown large enough to embrace everyone who needed what Ozzy had always given them. The chance to believe they belonged somewhere. The courage to be exactly who they were. The knowledge that being broken didn't mean being worthless. That's immortality, not living forever, but creating something so powerful that it outlasts every physical limitation time can impose. And Sharon Osbourne, the woman behind the warrior, had become its most fierce protector. Ozzy's transformation from outcast to icon proves that anyone can rewrite their story. If this untold chapter inspired you, share it with someone who needs to know their differences make them powerful. Subscribe for more revealing stories behind the legends that prove ordinary people become extraordinary.